my academic background is in chemistry and anthropology. And in anthropology, in the graduate program at UCSD, my dissertation was on religious conversion, and I specifically was interested in the mystical conversion type and mystical experiences as described by William James. And I've really had an interest in these things for most of my life, and suddenly got the opportunity to start studying ibogaine in 2009. And I started, as I'll explain a little bit more, started with a qualitative study, and then I started working with maps on the outcome study at 2 different clinics in Baja California. And now we're getting ready to, we've submitted the article for the first outcomes article on our study. We've submitted it for publication, and it's now, we've gotten comments back from reviewers, and we are working on revisions, and we're going to be resubmitting in the next week or 2. So it's been a busy time, but exciting, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Brad, for having me here, and thank you all for being here. So yeah, I was going to mention earlier when I introduced myself that I drove up here today from San Diego and barely made it before 6 o'clock. I parked around 10 minutes to 6. But as I was driving up here, I was struck by all these nostalgic feelings because I lived in LA in the LA area for 3 years in my early to mid-20s. And it reminds me of the line from a Neil Young song. He talks about the town in North Ontario, that all these changes were there. That's what I feel like about LA, because that's when I came here for graduate school in chemistry, and it was when I was living in LA that I had my first experience with psychedelics, first starting with LSD at a Grateful Dead concert at Laguna Seca, and then followed within a month or 2 by a psilocybin mushroom experience in Arizona. And those experiences, of course, profoundly changed me, and I wouldn't be sitting here if it hadn't been for those experiences. And so I always loved coming up to LA, even though the 3 years I spent here were pretty crazy in a lot of ways. So, but yeah. The talk I'm going to do today, this is the first time that I've been speaking to a group about my research with ibogaine, where I felt like I don't have to just talk about the research study, so I'm going to be a little bit more wide-ranging here. It presented some problems as I approached this, because I thought, I could talk about anything, and I was even going to talk about kratom, and I decided that I had so much material, it was difficult to work it into this time frame. So, as much time as there is, it was difficult to work in there. So. This slide is the first slide from, I'm stealing a lot of slides from Ken Alper, who has been working with me on the manuscript that we're in revision on that article, and we're going to submit the revisions in a week or 2. And we've submitted it to the American Journal on Drug and Alcohol Abuse, and it's going to show the outcomes from our study, and as I'll talk about the details of that shortly, but I've stolen some slides from Ken with his permission. He sent me the slideshow that he used recently in Prague, and so I'm going to be using some of his slides as well as a bunch that I made. So I'm going to start with a slide that I often use in my talks, which is just to show the. So I'm forgetting that I'm not actually hooked up in here. So Brad's going to be changing slides for me. Thank you, Brad. And probably most, if not all of you, are familiar with this already. But so ibogaine in the hydrochloride powder form is often put into capsules like that. And there's also the root bark powder, and this is the root itself. And next slide, please. And so, as again, probably most of you, if not all of you, know, ibogaine is derived from the iboga shrub, from the root bark. It's one of a dozen alkaloids in the root bark, and iboga, as Javier can tell us many more details than I can because I haven't experienced the iboga initiation ceremony, but it's been used in initiatory ceremonies in West Africa. There are some pictures here from Gabon and Cameroon. And so this has been used for initiatory purposes, and the experience, as I understand it, is oftentimes one of traveling to the land of the dead and having encounters with ancestors and ancestral spirits, and having, as Javier mentioned, the experience of death and rebirth. So, yeah, next slide, please. But I was wondering where to start with all this because I had so much material that I could use for this talk, and I decided that I would take the advice of the king from Alice in Wonderland and start at the beginning, which for me was, aside from a serendipitous experience in a car on the way up to Burning Man, just before this, I went to the Pangea Biomedics clinic in Playas de Tijuana. That's a picture of the front of it. Back in 2009, and the first person I spoke to there, other than the clinic director, was Sandy Hartman, who has, sadly she passed last year, but she was the first person I talked to about their ibogaine experiences. And she went on to do treatments herself and was also an advocate for integration work and aftercare. When I spoke with Sandy, she was one of around a dozen people that I interviewed who had gone to Pangea for treatment, all of them for ibogaine or for opioid dependence. And Sandy told me the story of how she came to Pangea. So she came back in 2009, in summer of 2009. She had driven from her farm. She's literally sold her farm in Tennessee, drove her car with her dog, Yuppie, all the way down to the clinic in Baja California. And she gave herself she called her 60th birthday present, was the treatment. She had been using opioid painkiller medications that for 12 years, stemming from severe injuries from an auto accident. And so she'd been using these for about 12 years, and it was severely dependent, and her nutrition was awful. She told me about having basically eating nothing but gummy bears and sweets, and was really in bad shape when she went to Pangea. So she had the treatment, and it worked really well for her. When I met her, she had had the treatment about a month previously, and she told me that within the first couple of weeks after treatment, she was still very weak. And as you can imagine, from years of malnutrition and from the effects of the substance dependence, she was still very weak, and she had a hard time climbing a flight of stairs. But when I saw her, she was much stronger. And she emphasized to me that the ibogaine isn't going to cure you. It's not going to do all the work for you. You have to do the work. And I've heard this from many people since then. There's still work to do after the treatment. And she told me then also that after the treatment, she drove to another clinic in Mexico to stay for a couple of weeks, and was able to be with other people who had also been treated with ibogaine, and said that the experience of talking with these people and that group, that community, and that support that they shared with each other was very important to her recovery and her ability to continue staying off of the opioids. So she was an advocate for a long time. For the rest of her life, she was an advocate for the importance of integration of the psychedelic experience, and also the importance of aftercare. So that's why I'm starting with Sandy as the story. Next slide, please. So she was the first person I interviewed, but I also interviewed about a dozen other people, and kind of did a narrative history of what they came to the clinic for, what their drug use history was, and what their ibogaine experience was like, and what happened aftermath of treatment. And I also administered a quality of life index, Ferens and Powers quality of life index, before and after treatment. And it was a really informal study. It was really just a pilot study. But I did show some positive results in the first couple of months after treatment. So their quality of life improved. And this is not just physical quality of life, but more psychosocial, psychospiritual quality of life. So in the narrative study, what I found was a typical pattern of people saying that before their treatment, they said, and this is a quote from Sandy, the opioids were stealing my life, is what she told me. And little by little, the opioids are stealing my life. And other people told me the same thing. You don't really have your life. The opioids are basically in control of your life. And people were coming to the clinic with severe depression and suicidality. Some people told me that, if the drugs didn't kill me, I was going to kill myself. Or, if this treatment didn't work, I was going to die. I'm sure I was going to die. As a humorous side note, there was one guy who I met who was he was so happy with his treatment that a few months later he had the word ibogaine tattooed onto his arm, and he was a really intense person. So he had been a professional, a world-class athlete. I met him. He was in his mid-30s. And at that point, he had been working for a firm in Las Vegas and was at a conference, or I think a staff meeting, in a high-rise on about the 30th floor. And he decided he wanted to kill himself right there. And so at this board meeting, it sounds like something from Hudsucker Proxy, but he decided he was going to run out and smash through the window and kill himself. So he went running full speed and smashed into this window, which didn't break. And so he bounced off of it and literally bounced back later on with the ibogaine treatment. But he credits that with saving his life, really. So, so the ibogaine experiences, what I'm finding from people is that they're having experiences showing past experiences. They'll re-experience times that they had when they were younger. And sometimes it's not really clear to them what the significance of these experiences is. Sometimes it's more clear. Sometimes they'll re-experience things from their past, or they'll have regrets about how they've treated people in their lives, about what the addiction and what their behavior has been doing, how it's been destroying their life and destroying their relationships. And then there's this sense that of the real presence of the damage that's done. So. And also sometimes a sort of a progression towards the future of what would my future be like if I don't stop using these substances that I'm enslaved to. One person said he envisioned himself living in the streets of New York and in the gutters and just being homeless and just being forgotten. Another young man said that he saw himself, so he came into treatment with his brother who was, he was in denial about alcoholism, but the person I interviewed was there for opioid painkillers. But his brother also decided to get the treatment while he was at Pangea, and he did it for the alcohol. And he was in denial about the alcoholism, but it actually worked for him as far as getting him off alcohol. But this fellow that I interviewed said that in his ibogaine experience, what he saw was that if he continued using, he and his brother were going to start this smuggling business, and they were going to buy. They had bought some boats, and they were smuggling heroin into the country, and then he started having an affair with his brother's girlfriend, and then he murdered his brother, and so he saw this future. He saw this future for himself, and he thought, I don't want that. So there's that compelling, if I continue on this path, this is what's going to happen. And so there's that motivator right there. And so that convinced me, talking with people, and even just talking with Sandy, the first interview, it was clear to me that there was a really powerful effect that ibogaine was having for people, and I wanted to see, what those results were and be able to quantify those. And then a few months later started working on the MAP study. And I aborted the quality of life and narrative study. I still have that data, but I didn't continue to collect data on that. So that stopped that study right there. Let's see. So other people talked about the treatment allowing them to hit the reset button. And if you read about ibogaine, you'll see this in people's comments about it too. I think Howard Lotsoff, who was the discoverer of this sort of effect, referred to it in that sort of way as well. I want to talk a little bit about how we can change the scheduling of ibogaine, or if it's even possible to do that, or to get it so it's maybe legal to treat people with ibogaine at some point in the U.S. I'm not optimistic about that, but the narratives I think are very powerful for convincing people of the power of the ability of ibogaine to work, but they won't really convince scientists because they'll just say it's anecdotal evidence. So the study that I'm going to talk about is going to show you some of that quantitative data that we can use. So next slide, please. I just put this in here so I remember to talk about this. So as I was saying, the people who came to Pangea oftentimes were feeling suicidal, they were depressed, they felt like they were really desperate. And I've heard people comment, or I've seen people comment on the internet, and I've heard people have asked me sometimes, why would people take something that they know is risky? So as you probably have heard, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there is some risk with taking ibogaine. Some people have died at the clinics, and there's some reason to believe that there's maybe some relation with ibogaine in terms of the causes of death. So some people would ask, why would anybody take something that might kill them? Well, if you think about what the situation is that they're in, and that they're suicidal, and that their lives have been stolen by the opioids, then for them it's a very easy decision to make. Next slide, please. Let's see. So I also want to have a theme, and we can return to this later, but of promoting access to safe treatment. And I think in terms of affecting legislation in the U.S. and maybe elsewhere, I think there are three basic routes towards that. One is to raise public awareness and increase public acceptance of ibogaine treatment. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of just lack of knowledge, and but I've seen the awareness of ibogaine increasing quite a lot since I started looking at ibogaine. When I started in 2009, I talked with Claire Wilkins, who was the clinic director at Pangea. Actually, she still is, but they've moved locations. And she was saying that people were just starting to find out about it. They were just starting to do things like there's a Vice episode, there's, I think, Law and Order or some other, there have been a few television episodes that have had ibogaine treatment mentioned in them. And so people were just starting to, the awareness on the part of the public was just starting to be increasing at that point. And I think it's come a long way in the last six or 7 years, but I think it's still increasing rapidly. But I think one way of changing things is to increase public awareness and also to increase the public acceptance of it. So we've seen that with changing the laws with medical marijuana and also recreational marijuana, that it's become much more acceptable publicly, and so that's kind of driven legislation. Part two, convincing the scientific and medical communities, which is a very different game. And for this, I think we need scientific data and scientific evidence. And the other one is state-by-state political efforts, I think, can be a way of doing it. I don't think that there's going to be a sudden shift on the part of NIDA or DEA to say, okay, we're going to reschedule ibogaine. But there have been some state efforts in New York and in Vermont and possibly elsewhere. I'm just starting to learn about some of these things. In the case of, say, medical marijuana and marijuana legalization, there's the examples of state-by-state progress, and I think that could possibly happen with ibogaine as well. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the history of ibogaine treatment. This man, Howard Lotsof, was the person who discovered the ability of ibogaine to reduce the cravings and the withdrawal symptoms from opioid dependence. He was 19 years old, living in New York City, and he was part of a group of people who were trying different psychoactive drugs to see what kind of therapeutic value they might have, and to just see what the experiences were like. And he was also dependent on heroin, and he found that when he had ibogaine for the first time, 36 or so hours later, after this monumental experience, he realized that he didn't crave ibogaine, or he didn't crave opioids, and he didn't crave ibogaine either, I don't think, at that point. But he also, so he didn't crave opioids, and he wasn't feeling the withdrawal symptoms you might have expected to feel at that point, having not had any heroin in the past couple of days. It took a long time for him to get around to patenting the procedures for using ibogaine to treat different substance dependencies. He eventually, though, in the 1980s, he took out patents on for ibogaine treatment for opioid dependence, nicotine dependence, alcohol, and a few others, polydrug dependence as well. And he made it his life's work to promote the treatment, and also he was very interested in seeing that there would be research done to show that ibogaine was effective. Next slide, please. So Howard Lotsof, 1962 in New York City. He tries it, and he and several friends also tried it, and most of them had similar sorts of results that Howard did. Also in the 60s, Chilean psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo was using smaller doses of ibogaine in psychotherapy. Next slide, please. There's a picture of Claudio Naranjo and a little excerpt from his book. Next slide, please. So in the 1960s, though, is when the legal status of ibogaine changed. When Howard Lotsof had it, a chemist friend of his provided some ibogaine, it was still legal in the U.S., but in the late 60s was when it became a Schedule I substance, and it was declared illegal in the U.S. And I hadn't known this, and I should point out that this is based on some internet meanderings that I have had over the past couple of weeks, but I found a video that had Terence McKenna in it, and he was talking about the scheduling of drugs, and he says that it was California that first started making these things illegal, and it was on the heels of there was a story of some man who jumped out a window, presumably, reportedly while he was on LSD, and there was an outcry on the public. I'm not sure on the part of the public, but there was an outcry, and eventually laws were changed so that things were made illegal, including ibogaine, bufotenine, which isn't actually psychoactive, but a whole bunch of things that were psychoactive. And as everyone here knows, I'm sure that the psychedelics became kind of associated with the counterculture in the late 60s. So many things were put on Schedule I and made illegal. So that was what happened with ibogaine. And late 1980s to 1990s, there was increasingly strong activism. So people were becoming aware, in part because of the work of Howard Lotsof, but people were becoming aware that ibogaine could be used to treat drug dependence. And in the Netherlands and the US, mostly in New York City, there were kind of junkie self-help movements, and there were people who were starting to do some research and also advocating for the legalization, or at least to allow people to use ibogaine for treatment. And one of the groups that was involved with this in the US was a group called ACT UP, which was involved in trying to get research and medications process for AIDS. But ACT UP was also interested in getting ibogaine legalized, and they were promoting ibogaine for the use in treatment for drug dependence, because shooting up heroin as a good way of transmitting HIV. So they were interested in that from that angle. Next slide, please. So this is something I found on the internet, but this is in the early 90s. This is, I think, from 1991. Storm NIDA for ibogaine. NIDA was holding hearings on to decide whether or not they should pursue research on ibogaine treatment for opioid dependence, and there was some activists who put this together who were saying, let's really let's coerce NIDA into allowing research and treatment to occur. Next slide, please. Let's see. So late 1980s, 1990s. Next slide, please. Actually, we're not seeing the bottom of that, but so this is a picture of so Howard Lotzoff on the right there, and his wife Norma Lotzoff, and a Dutch treatment provider standing out front of the treatment provider's apartment, which is the site of where she was doing treatment with ibogaine at the time. This was, I think, Dana Beal told me this was from 1991 that this was taking place. This picture was taken. Next slide, please. So let's see, ibogaine self-help groups. Let's see here, self-help groups. So in 1993, the FDA actually granted approval for phase 1 clinical trials in the U.S., and then 93, 94, NIDA developed phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, a protocol for that. And Dr. Deborah Mash at the University of Miami did a research study that she only published the results from the first month, and really didn't publish very much in the way of her results. But they treated hundreds of people at St. Kitts and they started a research study, which was ended. There was also a protocol for clinical trials in the Netherlands that was developed, and that one unfortunately never got underway, or was aborted shortly thereafter after it was started because of a death in the Netherlands by someone who was being treated for opioid dependence. Next slide, please. So in the late 1980s, early 90s, we start seeing people providing treatments in sometimes underground in the U.S., but also in places where it was not scheduled, and including Mexico and the Netherlands and elsewhere. So Ken Alper and Howard Lotzoff and Charles Kaplan did a study published in 2008, where it was an exhaustive study called the medical ibogaine subculture. And what they did was they contacted every clinic treatment provider that they could contact, and they asked how many people have you treated, what do you treat them for, and tried to get some idea of the results as well. And what they show in this article is that through early 2001, about fewer than 900 people had been treated with ibogaine outside of Africa. That's to distance that from the indigenous usage. And but then, as of February 2006, the number increased to almost 3,500. And that's not including maybe 20% that they were saying was that they couldn't really account for. So, but 3414 was how many they were able to account for. And the authors, as says here, they estimate that the number increased fourfold relative to 5 years earlier, an average yearly rate of growth of approximately 30%. So, so it was increasing rapidly at that time. Next slide, please. And at that time, so in that article, there's a listing of all the clinics that existed at the time. As I mentioned, the ibogaine underground, since it was illegal in the U.S. and still is, people were providing treatments in apartments or hotel rooms illegally. But there were above ground clinics operating in other places around the world, including in Canada, St. Kitts, Dr. Deborah Mash, also in Central America and South America, and in Europe as well, and South Africa. So we had a total of, outside of the United States with the underground treatments, 13 known clinics at that time. Next slide, please. And then back in 2014, in preparation for another talk that I was giving, I did a kind of quick and dirty reprisal of that study and attempted to contact by email or telephone, and I also spoke with Jonathan Dickinson, who at the time was head of GITA, the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance, to get a sense of how many clinics existed at that time. And what I found was that some of them I wasn't sure of, but I was able to get kind of a minimum number in different countries. In Mexico alone, there were 15 or more clinics, and that was, eclipsed the number that existed in the entire world in 2006. So you can see the pace of ibogaine treatment has continued to really rise, was also very rapid after 2006. We also see some new sites growing. I don't know if you can tell that these are bolded. The places that didn't have clinics in 2006, I bolded, so Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand. As you might know, in New Zealand in 2010, they made it legal for physicians to provide, to give prescriptions for ibogaine treatment if they were provided by someone who was licensed to do it. So in New Zealand, it's legal to do treatments. So at that point, there were, I think, I'm estimating 35 to 50 clinics around the world. So you can see that the number of clinics has really rapidly continued to grow. I don't know if that's continued in the last couple of years, but I suspect it has. There are a lot of clinics that sometimes they'll appear and then they'll be short-lived. Some of the clinics that were around in 2006 were still there in 2014, and many of them weren't. Yeah, so you can see that this is a rapidly changing picture. Next slide, please. So the barriers to access to treatment. Obviously, one of them is geographical, because you could see where the clinics existed. If you're not nearby one of those clinics and can't get to one of those clinics' sites, then you can't get the treatment, or you might be stuck with the underground clinic treatment, which is a lot less safe than going to a clinic that's doing the tests that they should be doing before you get treated with ibogaine. But also there are legal barriers, of course, because in many countries, including the United States, it's illegal. A lot of countries in Europe and elsewhere followed suit that the U.S., after the U.S. made many substances illegal and put them on Schedule I. A lot of other countries just said, okay, we're making them illegal as well, in solidarity with you. So there are legal barriers as well. Financial barriers, that is, if you go for treatment in Mexico, I think Jonathan told me a few years ago that you could expect to pay around $5,500 or $6,500. We have a couple of providers here that can kind of update that information. So there's a financial barrier as well, but I want to put that in context because a lot of people are going to rehab clinics in the U.S. and they're on methadone or buprenorphine maintenance and are spending tens of thousands of dollars for these treatments that may or may not work. So just to put that in context, but also to put it in a different context, people outside of the U.S. in less wealthy countries would have a much harder time, for the most part, affording that treatment. And I know that I've spoken with some treatment providers who have a sliding scale for their treatment cost, and have also provided free treatments for people who live locally at times too. So, that is obviously a good thing and is increasing access, but that financial barrier is still there. Another one is just the lack of awareness that ibogaine treatment exists, and misinformation. We'll look a little bit more about that, but there's a lot of misinformation about it, about ibogaine, about the dangers of ibogaine, and so yeah, and also there's a possibility that the scarcity of iboga will be a problem. There's already alarm about the rapidity with which iboga is being used, and the sources are being depleted, and there are people who are doing things about this. That is, there's a semi-synthesis of ibogaine from something called boacangine, which is plentiful and a much more abundant plant, the Pangea africana, I think it is. And so there's a chemist in California here named Chris Jenks, who's been doing some work, who came up with this semi-synthesis and also has showed people, and he has videos on the internet, you can find them on YouTube, where he'll show you, using household chemicals, how you can extract ibogaine from iboga root bark, and also how you can get voacangine, and so there are people doing some really good work to increase access to ibogaine treatment, and also to address the problem of potential scarcity of iboga, which, by the way, has been declared years ago. It's declared a national treasure by the country of Gabon, and so it is becoming more and more scarce, however, and as the number of treatments increase, and as people become more aware that treatments exist and that ibogaine can be effective, then that we can only expect that to continue to increase the demand. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I have to put this slide in here because this is the kind of iconic misrepresentation of ibogaine. This is from Hunter S. Thompson in a Rolling Stone article where during 1972, during the presidential campaign period, he published a piece in Rolling Stone magazine and asserted that Edwin Muskie, who was running for president, was a chronic user of ibogaine, and this is really good. He's got these before, during, and after pictures of Edwin Muskie, which I think is hilarious. And he's, I don't know if you can read this fine print here, but yeah, he's later in the campaign. However, it is reported that Senator Muskie was a known user of a powerful drug called ibogaine. So so that's Hunter S. Thompson with that entry in 1972. Next slide, please. But the misinformation and is out there all over the place. It's kind of unfair for me to put a picture of my friend and colleague Ken Alper up here for this, but Ken is actually somebody who's fighting against this misinformation, and he's doing really good research. This is a YouTube video of Ken's. He talks about ibogaine fatalities. He's published a paper in 2012 where he talks about the ibogaine fatalities that had occurred through, I think, 2008. And this talk is a very good one if you want to find out more about ibogaine fatalities. But I printed the screen here, and unfortunately, I don't even have my reading glasses, so I can't read the fine print on my computer. But if you look at up here, I don't know if anybody up there closer can see some of those titles, but I'm having a hard time making them out. But you can see there are a lot of videos now about ibogaine. And you see that Ken's video has over 30,000 viewers. This was just a couple weeks ago. And a lot of these other ones have tens of thousands, even over 100,000. The documentary, that one's got over 100,000 views. But you'll see people commenting on these videos, things like, next slide, please. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So this is in the comments here. Oh, I like this one. Lies in his eyes. They're talking about Ken. That he's not lying, but the comments are great. So if people are as desperate to clean up that they choose to take iboga, so here you have somebody who's saying this is dangerous. Why would anybody ever do this? And oh, good, thanks. Yeah. So someone's saying, is there legit treatment for USA in the USA for the ibogaine? No, it's illegal in the U.S. So 13 fatalities in 18 years is not statistically significant. So a little bit of awareness of how you might want to look at these scientifically, but Ken actually goes into great detail about this because he got a medical examiner in New York City to look at all the cases, and at that point, I think there were 19 fatalities that were in close temporal proximity to ibogaine treatment, and for 14 of those, there were really good toxicological reports or coroner's reports about the causal, the proximal causes, and possibly the actual causes of death there. And so what Ken says is that in 12 of those 14 cases, there were pre-existing medical comorbidities. So most prominently pulmonary disease, cardiac disease, and also hepatic disease. Or it was known that the person within 24 to 48 hours after treatment was using some illicit substance, usually cocaine or some opioid. And this is clearly a risky thing to do right after you have ibogaine. For one thing, ibogaine potentiates the opioid effect so that you don't need nearly as much of the opioid to get the same effect. So if you're used to having a certain dosage of the opioid, and then right after your ibogaine treatment, you have that same dosage, it could kill you. So what Ken is saying here is that in most of the cases for which there was really good data on these deaths, there were other factors that may have been more important than the fact that they had just had ibogaine treatment in those deaths. So if you're a treatment provider, I would highly recommend seeing the video from Ken and also finding that paper on the internet. Next slide, please. Let's see. So I think we can probably skip this. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, that's just a close-up. Yeah, next slide, please. Let's see. Yeah, I like this too. So don't order from Iboga World. They scam me for $300. You can get Iboga root bark on the internet now, but it may not be what you may not actually get what you're shopping for. This person said ibogaine saved my life. So you have these very extreme different viewpoints that you can find on the internet. Next slide, please.
Iboga World, they do offer good products, though. So like I wouldn't follow what you see on that.
That's yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so people can say anything they want to on on the internet. Obviously, this is another kind of other opposite side. I don't want to pick on any treatment provider for sure, but this was an easy one to find. This one entitled "Cure Heroin or Meth Addiction Instantly Without Withdrawal: Iboga and Ibogaine." Now, to me, in my mind, that's much closer to the truth than a lot of the stuff that's out there. But it's on the other side in its extremity, that is saying that it's going to instantly cure your addiction. Next slide, please. This is from the November Scientific American article, which was in this, which I feel like I was cheated out of my $750 for buying this. But the article you can see is "Get Clean or Die Trying." And I don't know if you can focus in on that, Brad, but ibogaine, an anti-addictive drug that is illegal in the U.S., could cure more drug users than any other treatment or kill them. So this is their cover pages for the article. And I found the article disappointing for a number of reasons, but that was one of the things that really stuck out to me. And I know that some people who are seeking ibogaine treatment, see that and they think that's, it could be scary. But one of the things that was discussed in this article, there's one study that was done. There was many preclinical studies of ibogaine treatment, animal studies, but one of them showed that Purkinje cells in the rat could be damaged by a high dosage of ibogaine. And so this has not been replicated. It's one study, and the other studies were not showing this, and it's been done in many species, rodent species, also some primate species, and no other study has shown this kind of thing. But this article focused on that. And they said, so it's dangerous, and it could kill you. If it doesn't kill you, it's going to probably at least cause brain damage. Okay, so we have this coming from Scientific American. Next slide, please. And this is from a scientific journal. This is actually the journal that Ken and I first submitted our article to, and they rejected it within 48 hours, which was fortunate because we were able to submit to another journal. But this is an article they published a few months earlier, and the title being Ibogaine for Treating Drug Dependence, What is a Safe Dose? And what they're saying here in summary is that the dosages that are usually being used for treatment are high enough that they're unsafe. And so this journal came out with that article, and they're also, you can see here in the abstract, it's been it can successfully treat rodents, but it's also been shown to cause neuronal injury, Purkinje cells in the rat cerebellum. So they're referencing that same study, which is the one study that's shown that kind of thing. So there's limited evidence. They admit there's limited evidence, but they're also focusing on this. Next slide, please. And this is a slide from Ken rebutting the idea that ibogaine is overly dangerous. So it also echoes some of the things that you've seen in the comments from people online in the slides that I showed previously, which is that ibogaine can be dangerous, but is it as dangerous as some of the things that are out there? One of the comments that I didn't look at was, antidepressants can be dangerous, right? So they've been shown some of them have been shown to increase the risk of suicidality. And also, as we know, methadone is dangerous. It's also an opioid and has been linked to deaths. So Ken had summarized his findings here. He's saying that roughly, as far as close as he can tell, roughly there's one ibogaine-related death out of every 427 treatment episodes. And when he's saying ibogaine-related death, he's saying he's careful to point out that this is temper-related, because it hasn't been shown that ibogaine is killing anybody, but it's in combination with other factors. So he's saying ibogaine-related deaths, 1 in 427 treatment episodes. Methadone, an Australian study showing that one methadone-related death for every 364 treatment episodes. And also in a Utah study showing one methadone-related death for every 476 methadone prescriptions. So methadone, looked at that way, methadone is as dangerous as ibogaine. And so you've got to consider the context and consider what the alternatives are as well. All right, next slide, please.
Those deaths were directly related.
Yeah, I would think so as well. Yeah, and a side note here. So in New Zealand, and I'll talk a little bit about this more, but there was a sister study that was done in New Zealand by my colleague Jeff Noller, and he says that the main problem drug in New Zealand is methadone. It's redirected medical methadone that people are using, and one of the main reasons why New Zealand decided to allow for prescriptions of ibogaine treatment was that there were so many people being killed by methadone. And so, as you might be aware, methadone has a longer half-life than a lot of opioids, longer half-life than morphine and heroin. And so if you're using it and you've still got a lot in your system and you amp up with some more methadone, then you could give yourself a fatal dose just doing that. So methadone is pretty dangerous as well. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward to where we are on my computer here so I can at least sort of continue along this line. Okay, so yeah. So Brad, I have a tendency to kind of lose my sense of the timing when I'm speaking. So
Yeah, about 45 minutes.
Okay, great. So all right, yeah, I'll just continue with looking at my slides here. So yeah, so we need to have good evidence for what's happening. Obviously, with ibogaine treatment, we need to know what's happening, and we need to show whether or not it's effective for both opioid detox and other drug detox, and also for stopping people from using on the long term. But there haven't been very many published studies, and that's one reason why MAPS undertook a couple of studies to show what the efficacy of ibogaine treatment is. So there is really kind of scant research, and since I don't have the slide up, I'll just cover it really briefly. There were treatments done in the Netherlands in the 90s, and there was a retrospective study done on, I think, 52 people, where they asked them, after your treatment, how long did you stop using ibogaine for? And Ken has a slide of this showing that of those 52 people, about a third were able to go for 6 months or more without using anything after their treatment. So yes, and this was data that was presented to NIDA in the early 90s by Howard Lotsoff, and that was part of the reason NIDA undertook an ibogaine project that was later cut short. So there was that evidence for ibogaine as a kind of a detox agent.
Is there any indication that that group, what follow-up treatment was done with them, or did they just do medicine and they all went home?
Just the medicine, and actually, so for the most part, they just had a single treatment. Some people, I think there was a subset that had a booster treatment in the months thereafter. So yeah, and this information is also, you can find this on the internet, but about 20% said that they were abstinent from their problem substance for over a year. And so there's that data which hasn't been published, but there have been some published studies as well. Again, I'm trying to get back to that slide. Let's see. So the main study that had been done before 2014 was by Deborah Mash, and as I was saying earlier, her team treated hundreds of people in St. Kitts, and they started a study where they were looking at cocaine-dependent people and also opioid-dependent people, and they were looking at detox effects. So they're using something called SOWS, which we also use at the subjective opioid withdrawal scale, and also the objective opioid withdrawal scale, or OWS. And they also were going to look at the usage of opioids after treatment and use of cocaine after treatment. But what they ended up doing was only publishing results from the first couple of weeks to 1 month. But they did show some interesting results. So we're not able to get past that slide.
No, I just don't know which one.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide at this point. Okay. So yeah, so I don't even have Deborah Mash's up there. It might not be in the next slide, but essentially what they showed was that the SOWS scores, the subjective opioid withdrawal scores, were decreased dramatically and quite significantly after treatment. So they showed that ibogaine was effective as a detox agent, and they also showed that it reduced craving scores for both the opioid users and the cocaine users. That they reduced the craving scores within a few days after treatment, and then those craving scores were also reduced at 1 month, I believe. They also looked at depression scores, and I think they used the Beck Depression Inventory, which we also used, and showed that depression scores were significantly reduced a few days after treatment and then also at 1 month follow-up. But they really didn't publish much else from that study. There were some patent disputes, so this is as related to me by Ken Alper, who knows the history very well, but also there's a current contemporary history of ibogaine treatment, which you can find the article on the internet, but Ken is one of the authors of that also, along with Howard Lotsoff and Charles Kaplan. But they're saying that, lost my train of thought there, sorry. I'm working on sleep deprivation, and also I'm fasting, so I'm trying to induce an altered state while I'm talking, which seems to be working. So yeah, the Deborah Mash study, so there was a patent dispute. Howard Lotsoff, as I mentioned, he patented the procedure, the treatment procedure, and there were some disputes between he and Deborah Mash about what kind of data, who would own the data, and who would be able to patent what. Ibogaine itself is not patentable because it's a natural product, but you can patent the treatment procedure. And Deborah Mash was at least, as I understand it, was considering the idea of patenting noribogaine, which is the primary metabolite of ibogaine. And she thinks that noribogaine is as effective as ibogaine. There is some evidence for this in animal studies, I think. But she was thinking about patenting that, but there were these patent disputes between Lotzoff and Deborah Mash. And that study, according to Ken Alper, that's the reason why those things have never been published.
Well, and weren't some issued for utility that in the treatment of addiction, but then they're domain now? So that they're
So because of the passage of 25 years.
Correct.
Yes,
So,
okay,
so
yeah.
the ones that were issued for the use of this, and now, like, again, for pharmaceutical companies, there's absolutely no benefit, plus it's a one use
Yeah.
done as opposed to continuous use with methadone spots.
That's an excellent point, yeah. So, and this is one of the points that's often raised, is that if people can be cured with one treatment, then the pharmaceutical companies don't have the financial incentive to pursue that, to pursue clinical trials. So that's a big problem for ibogaine development.
Chemicals have incentive to pose it as dangerous.
Yeah, so actually, as an aside here, I did want to talk about this, that how many people here have heard about something called 18MC? Okay, so a handful. So 18MC, 18-methoxychloronaridine, is a synthetic congener of ibogaine. It's an intelligent drug design product, and I think it was developed by Stanley Glick at NYU. But it's also been shown, like ibogaine, it's been shown in preclinical studies with animals to be effective at reducing withdrawal symptoms, withdrawal-like symptoms in animals, and also reducing the self-administration of drugs, so that pressing the lever to get more heroin or morphine. So 18-MC has been shown to be around the same in terms of its effectiveness at producing those kinds of results as ibogaine. And it's thought that 18-MC doesn't have the same psychoactive effects. It doesn't have the same serotonergic effects as ibogaine, so you would expect that it doesn't have the same sort of psychedelic or visionary effects that ibogaine does. And so 18-MC is out there, and it also reportedly doesn't have the same kinds of cardiac effects. So ibogaine causes prolongation of the QT interval, which I'm kind of just parroting that because I don't really understand the physiology all that well, but those of you who are MDs will get that. But that is thought to be why it's risky for people with a history of cardiac disease. So 18-MC does not seem to have that same kind of effect, and may be safer, and doesn't have the same kind of ataxia, what it kind of causes a paralysis, ibogaine does, and inability to move around. And 18-MC probably doesn't have that same kind of effect. So what people are saying is it doesn't have these same kind of adverse side effects. And people also lump together the psychedelic effect as an adverse side effect. And this is what I've heard people talking about it this way. Scientists and MDs will sometimes refer to the psychedelic effect as an adverse side effect. And so apart from the idea that it might be helpful, it's actually problematic to have that kind of effect. So 18-MC is held as this could be something that doesn't have those same effects, but also is effective at treating, and maybe at least for detox. So of course, it would be great to be able to do a side-by-side comparison. There is a company, I think it's a company called Savant, that was granted $6.5 million by U.S. Granting agency. I'm not sure which one, but maybe NIH. But they were given $6.5 million to do a human trial for 18-MC. So I don't know, I haven't heard anything about what their results are, if they're actually doing the study or not. I'm not sure, but I also haven't heard of any reports of anyone ever trying 18-MC. So whether it's actually not psychoactive or whether it has any real effects in humans, it remains to be seen. So the rats have said it. Yeah, but the rat studies and other studies that have been done, it has a similar effect for at least cravings and withdrawal symptoms. But we don't know if it changed their lives afterwards. We don't know.
I was going to ask, isolated rats or rat park rats?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we don't know if they had any insight from 18-MC or if it really changed their lives. So Yeah, so let's see, where were we? Previous studies, we can kind of skip through this, but basically what I wanted to show is that there haven't been very many studies. These studies, Charles Kaplan's study was published, but in summary, there really, at this point, hasn't been much evidence published to show that ibogaine is effective for anything beyond the detox in the first couple of weeks. So there have been a few short-term, a few retrospective studies where they're asking people, how did you do after treatment? But there isn't the kind of evidence that's useful for convincing the scientific and medical communities that ibogaine is effective. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is another slide from Ken, who is much better at knowing the pharmacology of it, but I'm trying to get up to speed on this. So it's not a substitution therapy like methadone or buprenorphine. It has some effect at I think mu and kappa opioid receptors, but it does not have that agonist. It's not a strong agonist at the mu opioid receptors like methadone and buprenorphine. As he says here, it's neither an orthosteric nor allosteric mu opioid receptor agonist. Let's see. Also, it's not like clonidine. It doesn't have the affinity for the alpha-2 receptor or the imidazoline I2 site. Okay, so it's not like clonidine, and it's not a placebo effect. There's no clinically significant placebo effect for opioid detox. It's not a placebo will not stop you from going into withdrawal. So it's a novel mechanism. It's not like standard treatments. It's not quite clear how ibogaine is doing what it's doing, either for the detox effects or for any long-term effects it might have. But it's clearly not like anything else that's being used in standard treatment. Next slide, please. Here's the chemical structure of ibogaine shown here. Next slide, just for comparison, 18-MC. So structurally very, very similar. Noribogaine is like ibogaine, except I think it's got one methoxy group. Maybe it's demethylated, I think, at one of the sites from ibogaine. Next slide, please. So let's see. This is the title slide for the paper that Ken and I are resubmitting now that we're just about done with revisions. This is work that was supported by MAPS, and as I'm going to show you the results that we're publishing in this journal article. So hopefully the video of this won't get out really soon, but so this is what we're putting out there, but it's only a subset of the data that we have, and I'll hopefully have time to talk about that a little bit. But we have other data that we're not putting into this paper because we don't have as tight a control on it, and there aren't as many. Our N is smaller for some of these, and I'll hopefully have a chance to talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of two studies that was supported by MAPS. The other one was the study in New Zealand by Jeff Noller, and he's also completed his study and has also submitted the article to the American Journal on Drug and Alcohol Abuse. So his article is also under review right now, and we're hoping to get them published in the same issue. So we'll have them maybe back to back in the same issue. So in both of these studies, the primary measure is the Addiction Severity Index, light, or ASI light. Secondary measures are SOWS, the Subjective Opioid Withdrawal Scale, as I mentioned earlier, the Beck Depression Inventory, the States of Consciousness Questionnaire, and other things. Also, I did calls with significant others, and we tried to get people to do drug testing, but that turned out to be very difficult to do, in part because people weren't near drug testing sites. It was too inconvenient for them, or they couldn't get out of work. It didn't work for very many people to get to a drug testing site around the time of the follow-up interviews. But the basic study design was before treatment measures, right before treatment, and then monthly follow-up measures for 12 months after treatment. So the ASI Lite and the Beck Depression Inventory and a few others were done monthly after treatment. And in Mexico, we enrolled 30 participants, and New Zealand, they enrolled 14, I believe. Might have been 13. It was either 13 or 14. And yeah, so I had calls with the people in the study, the 30 participants, as well as their significant others who knew about their drug use as much as anybody could know, who wasn't actually them. So we tried to corroborate what the participants were telling us about their drug use, and also kind of have another secondary sort of way of assessing their drug use after treatment. Next slide, please. So in the article we're putting out, what we're doing is we're kind of streamlining it. And so we have, as I said, 30 individuals who presented with DSM-4 opioid dependence, with physiological dependence. And the treatments were done, the average dosage was 1540 milligrams plus or minus 920. And 5 of those 30 people also had had total alkaloid mixtures along with the ibogaine HCl. So we used the SOWs, as I said. We're going to report on the SOWs data, and we're reporting on the addiction severity index data. And what we did, because we had a lot of, it was difficult to follow up with everybody. And so I was doing phone follow-ups, and a few people dropped out of the study immediately. So even out of a small number, that is 30 people starting the study, a few people dropped out even before the first. I couldn't even do one follow-up with them. So I was trying to do monthly follow-ups. In summary, what we're doing in part to make up for kind of the data gaps is to squeeze follow-up data into more discrete groupings. So we had the month one-month numbers, but we took the 2, 3, and 4 and grouped them into the 3-month, and then we did the same thing for 5, 6, and 7, 8, 9, and 10, and then the 11 and 12-month follow-ups. We grouped those scores for the purposes of data analysis. Next slide, please. So the 3 questions that we're addressing with this study are, one is ibogaine effective in opioid detoxification? Does it reduce, and we're looking at that with the SOWs, does it reduce the opioid withdrawal scores from before treatment to after treatment? And question 2 is there a treatment effect evident at 1 month post-treatment? So we're using the addiction severity index before and after, and we're using the 1 month scores to see if there was a treatment effect at 1 month. Question 3 is a treatment effect observed at 1 month post-treatment also sustained at later time points? And next slide, please. So,
in any or all of these, are they receiving any other kind of therapies afterwards, or is it strictly?
Some people were, but yeah, so. Yeah, so I think, I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but I think there were 9 people who had some kind of follow-up that ranged from either getting a second ibogaine treatment. I think we had 3 people who had follow-up ibogaine treatments. We had some people who went into a kind of classic residential rehab facility. We had people who were doing 12-step. So I think we had 9 people out of the 30 who had some kind of follow-up treatment or aftercare treatment.
They had a higher percentage of
They didn't actually. So yeah, I've got a slide that actually is very good for that, and we'll follow up on that. So the patient population. So everyone was reporting with opioid use disorder, and they presented with having used 29, an average of 29 plus or minus 3.2 days out of 30 at the time of the of treatment, and let's see, and they had at least one opioid substance for an average of 5 years prior to treatment. 5.2 years. Most commonly used drugs were heroin, followed by prescription analgesic opioids. 29 out of the 30 patients had at least one previous treatment for substance use disorder, and the average was 3.1 treatments, plus or minus 2.6 prior to coming to ibogaine treatment. Most commonly, the treatments were methadone or buprenorphine maintenance treatments. Next slide, please. So the first question is it effective for opioid detox? Next slide. We're using the subjective opioid withdrawal scale, or SOWS, and this shows you the items. There are 16 items rated by the patient before treatment, and the treatments will start right after someone starts going into withdrawal. They start showing withdrawal, and the treatment will start. So right before the treatment starts, we're getting the opioid withdrawal scale, and then we're doing a follow-up a few days after treatment. So these 16 items are rated on a scale of 0 to 4, with 0 being not at all, to 4 being maximum. And you can see the different withdrawal symptoms that they're rating themselves on. Next slide, please. So our results are here. This is showing you, so the scores on the left ranging from 0 to 64 would be the maximum score you could get. Average score that we had coming in was 31, plus or minus 7.6. So here's the pre-treatment scores and post-treatment scores. You can see that there are actually 3 people who had increased SOWS scores, but 27 people had decreased SOWS scores. And the treatment, the significance of that was, at a very high level. And this is a few days post-treatment that they're getting these scores done. Next slide, please. So here's our data on the left. And this is the paper that was by Handelsman and et al. In 1987, where they were first talking about this instrument. First described here in this article in 1987. So this one on the left, you can see the SOWS scale here, the scores. And this is before treatment. This is before and after methadone. Okay, so this population here on the left is opioid abuse only. And you can see before and after. Everyone actually improved, and this is with methadone, after methadone. And here you've got a population that's opioid plus other substance abuse. Most commonly, I think, alcohol and benzodiazepines. And you can see that their data, the data here looks strikingly similar to what we're getting with ibogaine. And this is with methadone. And Ken here is saying, again, this is a slide from Ken, note the effect size is comparable to that of methadone in the Handelsman article on the right. And the data look really strikingly similar. We have some people here actually increasing in their SOWS scores. And those are the people, this is the comorbid population, that is people who are opioid dependent and dependent on something else. Next slide, please. And this is just a slide to show what the normal course of withdrawal would be. Again, SOWS scores on the left, and this is withdrawal with this is just straight, cold turkey from opioids. Day of withdrawal 0, you can see the SOWS scores peaking around 2 or 3 days after, which is actually when we're doing the second measure, the second follow-up. So the scores, you expect to go up if they haven't had any opioids, which are, of course, our patients haven't had any opioids since their ibogaine treatment, and then they kind of tail off down by about day 5. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next question, so obviously we're showing a good effect with opioid detox. Next question is, was there a treatment effect at 1 month? Next slide, please. And we're using the Addiction Severity Index. And this is a scale that has 7 different subscales. It has drug and alcohol abuse severity. So that's measuring drug use, and also, so here this is showing the drug use scale. So we've got drug use, alcohol use, and also some related problem areas like medical problems, legal problems, psychiatric, employment, and family and social status. So, so the way this works is that in the drug use one, we're asking, have you used any of these substances in the last 30 days? And how often have you used them in 30 days? So how many days out of 30 have you used them? And there's always the subjective question, how troubled or bothered have you been the last 30 days by your drug problems? And how important is it to you to get treatment for these drug problems? So each of the scales has this sort of subjective part as well. It also has the more objective sort of things. Like the family and social one has things like how well have you been getting along with people in your life that matter, like family members and close friends. and what's your living situation, things like that. So let's see, each of the sub-scores, ASIC scores, has a value in the range of 0 to 1.0, with higher scores indicating a higher severity of problems in that area. Next slide, please. So the ASIC scores, here's our data. Baseline right before treatment, and you can see the different sub-scores listed here on the left. Mean score, standard deviation, and you can see the highest one going in is the drug use at 0.4, and alcohol use is the lowest one. So this is not a population that tends to have much of the problem in the way of alcohol usage. And then 1 month post-treatment, you see the mean scores here, standard deviations, and this is a test of difference from the baseline to 1 month. And you see we're getting significantly reduced scores in these 4 areas, and we're getting, actually it's a significantly increased score in employment status. That's easily explained by the fact that a lot of people were taking time off from their work to go get the treatment. So they're having employment problems in that month after treatment. So you can see here with drug use, less than 0.01 significance. Legal status, are they getting in trouble with the law? Or do they feel like they're in trouble? Family and social status, how well are they getting along with people in their lives? That one also less than 0.01 significance, a p-value. And then psychiatric status is right there at the 0.05 level. So we're showing these effects at 1 month post-treatment. Next slide, please. This is a spaghetti plot of all the people in the study. And ASIC scores for drug use on the left here, from 0 up to the highest ones around 0.6, it looks like. And then the follow-ups, 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12 out here. And you can see the individual trajectories are all over the place. But you can also see that, next slide, please. 1 month post-treatment, so with that group circled there, that there's a good trend towards going down towards 0 in the severity score for drug use. And there's some people didn't go down as much, and you can see some people didn't get the 1 month follow-up, and they went right to the 3 month follow-up. So that's missing data there. Next slide, please. So you can see that there's a significant number of people in those 30 that are getting a good treatment effect at 1 month, and that as a population that's significant. And interestingly, so we had 20 people following up at 1 month. If you assumed that the other 10 people that we couldn't reach at 1 month did not change their scores in the drug subscore, if you put that in the equation, we still get significant results. So if you just say they didn't get a treatment effect at all, we still have significance. So the question 3, is that treatment effect sustained after later time points after 1 month? Next slide. And what we're using for this is a test of non-inferiority to test whether or not the score is not worse than the score at 1 month. So we're comparing 3, 6, 9, and 12 month values with the 1 month follow-up value here. And this data is very hard to read, I'm sure, but this shows all of our follow-up data and the different subscales. And you see here the 3, 6, 9, or 12 month post-treatment. So we're doing an inferiority test, inferiority test relative to 1 month baseline. And what we're showing here is that in the areas that we had a good treatment effect, drug use, legal status, family social status, and psychiatric status, that the scores did not, so a p-value of less than 0.05 here indicates that the scores did not get worse over time. And you can see that consistently these scores, did not get worse in the follow-up periods. And if you look up here, employment status, actually what that's showing is actually that it got better. So that's why that p-value is there, is like that. I'm not really clear on the non-inferiority test, but I think that's the other tail of the significance, that is employment status actually improved. But the other ones did not significantly change. Actually, alcohol use, well, anyway. I'm not sure how to explain that right now, so we won't go into that. But we can see that the improvement that's evident for drug use, legal, family, social, psychiatric scores was maintained at subsequent 3, 6, 9, and 12 months.
The social acceptance is everywhere, alcohol being everywhere, so the reason that it seems.
So yeah, I think you're asking whether about the scores not changing. So we didn't see a significant change for alcohol use. Yeah, so I can address that. So the alcohol was not generally a problem for people in the study. So the fact that we're not seeing an effect is probably due to a kind of a floor effect, that as a population, they're low scores in severity there. So they didn't change over time either. Okay, next slide, please. This is a different way of looking at the data. This is a percentage of opioid-free days in the last 30. So you can see that time 0 at treatment. So this is based on my first interview with them. And I asked them, how many days in the last 30 were you using these substances? And this is all for any opioid substances. About 1 day out of 30, because you remember I showed you that 29 out of 30 was the number of days that they were using. So 1 day out of 30, or 3.3%, was the number of days that they were not using in the previous month prior to treatment. At 1 month, that number rises to 92%. So this is the percentage of opioid-free days on average for the people I was able to get follow-up data on. And that stays high, but you can see that it goes down at 3 months and then kind of stays relatively stable through the next, for the next 9 months. Next slide, please. So this is again the spaghetti plot that I showed earlier, and this is showing what happens after the first month. So if we look at what happens afterwards, it's useful to split this up. So what Ken and I decided to do was to separate them into 2 groups. We're going to look at the people who had a good treatment effect. We're calling good treatment effect people who had a reduction of 75% or more in their ASIC drug score at 9 months or at 12 months. So these are people who are out here, they're showing a 75% reduction from their baseline score in the drug. So that's one group. The other group is the people who didn't show that 75% or greater reduction in the drug use score, severity score. Next slide, please. So Ken has done this work for me. Next slide. Oh, actually, it's not showing it. Maybe it shows on the right. If you can scan over, but it might not. Okay, so we won't see that, but kind of imagine if we could take these. So the number of people in the good outcomes is 12, and that number is really there at 12 because that's about how many people I was able to have follow up at 9 and 12 months because there was a lot of dropout in the study. We have 18 people that didn't have that reduction at 9 or 12 months, right? So if you can take those spaghetti plots, you've got people who are down here. Actually, it might be useful to just go back to the previous slide. And so, the close-up view. So we're talking about people who are down here, and there's a good number that stayed down here. You see that they shot down to this, and some people went back up, and then they see this one right here. There's one that went up and then went back down. So that one is included in the good group because right there he's showing a good score. Whereas this one's not. But there are 18 people who were not in the good outcomes group. And if you take those 12 and you plot those by themselves, you see this nice, okay, you've got a bunch of people who stay down here or who maybe at some point bounce up here and then did better in later months. That was something I saw in, I think, 3 or 4 people in the study. So what we're saying here is that the treatment effect is sustained at later time points, and also that it's a significant portion of these 30 people. So, someone might take issue with the fact that we had this lot of dropout in the study, that this is not representative of the entire sample. Okay, it's a fair argument, but our counter argument is this is a real world scenario. For one thing, we're showing treatment effects in a real world situation of actual treatment at a clinic, and we're showing that it's difficult to follow up with people. But the other thing is that we're showing a significant subsection of people who are treated are doing really well at 9 or 12 months. And next slide, please. Actually, 2 slides forward. And So to get back to what Tyler was asking about, relationship of baseline characteristics of subsequent outcome. The subjects of the favorable versus less favorable outcomes. So I said n equals 12 and n equals 18. We do some testing between these two groups, and we can show that the subjects in the less favorable outcome group had a higher number of prior treatment episodes. So the average going in of the entire group was 3.1. Those in the less favorable group had a higher number of treatment episodes, 3.8 versus 2.0 in the favorable. I'm sorry. Yeah. So you can see that people in the favorable treatment. So they were probably more severe cases.
Well, treatment resistant too. They become after
Treatment resistant. Exactly. So that's one thing that they're showing is significant in the differences between these two. Interestingly, people who were undergoing methadone maintenance treatment at the time that they entered treatment with ibogaine, those people are showing less favorable outcomes. So people who are on methadone are more resistant to the ibogaine treatment.
By any chance track how long they were off of those synthetic opiates? How long before they took ibogaine?
We have, actually that data, I think we didn't get that from the clinics. So they were, as you can imagine, they were doing tapering, and they were.
Have a protocol 3 weeks. Most of them would, or whatever it is. But okay, but that.
Yeah. So I had to contact the treatment providers for that. I don't have that information. So methadone treatment, and also a trend towards more, the number is 0.072, the p-value, but more benzodiazepine use. So this gets at the drug comorbidity. Again, more kind of severe cases. These are people who were using other substances and who were using a lot of benzodiazepines, who are showing up in the less favorable outcome group. And there are no differences in the two groups between, in the demographic features, any of the demographic features that we're looking at. Use of substances other than methadone or benzodiazepines. That includes buprenorphine, by the way. And whether the substance identified with as most problematic was heroin or something else, or IV heroin use. So you might expect that IV heroin users are more resistant to treatment, but we're not showing that in this. But it's a small n, but we're showing that they're getting the same treatment effect as the other group. All right, so next slide. Same thing I showed already. Next slide, please. So this is just comparatives to another study that's been done. We don't have to look at this, but this is, if you want to look at a placebo group, 60% opioid-free days over a 24-week period after treatment. And that's compared to, I think at 1 month we were showing 90% opioid-free days, and at 3 months around 75%. So that's up here. This is the naltrexone group. It was injectable naltrexone. So they were under constant treatment and surveillance, and they obviously did quite well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is also to compare results in another paper. Just really briefly, this paper was looking at outcomes after or with or without psychological counseling. And this, after 8 weeks after buprenorphine naloxone taper, they're showing success rates of 7.4% and 5.8%, which does not sound good. And with counseling is actually worse, but not significantly so. Yeah.
It actually makes sense because most people don't want to go to counseling.
Yeah, that could have. Yeah. I mean, it's just annoying. So, next slide, please. So comparing our results to what they got, we're showing our comparison, and this is based on 4 or fewer days of use over the past 30 days. So that's the percentage of how they're defining success. So their 6.6 was in between 2 and 3 months, and this is our data, and this is out of the number of respondents in the study. That's the people I was able to actually reach. This is if you take the entire N, the large N, and divide it by 30, you can see our success rates, 79% at 1 month, and they stay pretty stable. And then if you look out of the entire population, these numbers are lower largely because I was able to reach fewer people at those follow-up periods. All right, next slide, please. So we could talk about qualitative perspectives. I think I want to wrap by just talking a little bit about this. Some of the recurrent themes, and this is going into the paper. I've got a lot more data that's just from my own qualitative work. But what we're saying in the article is that it's giving people an opportunity to stop opioid use. It gives them a period of diminished cravings and an opportunity for personal change. And this is something you can say that iboga will give an opioid addict several months to half a year of freedom from cravings and an expanded awareness. And this was a common sort of theme that we would say it would help you for that period of time. However, it will help you. It will not do the work for you, but it will help you do your own work. That was another recurring theme. That it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to cure you. You have to do work still. So that again comes back to the importance of aftercare and integration that Sandy Hartman was an advocate for. Also, insight and meaning attributed to the psychoactive state. To me, this is very important. I think that this is the big thing about ibogaine. There's something biochemical happening that's helping with detox that doesn't seem to be happening with other psychedelics, other plant medicines. LSD and psilocybin and ayahuasca, ketamine have been shown to be helpful at helping people stop using substances. But ibogaine seems to be the only one that has this effect on reducing withdrawal symptoms and cravings in the short term afterwards. So why that is happening biochemically, we don't know, but it seems like there's something about ibogaine that's special, right? But the insight and meaning, I think you're getting that from iboga, from ibogaine, but also from the LSD, from the ketamine, from the psilocybin and the ayahuasca. So maybe this is just a hypothesis of maybe there's something biochemical happening with the ibogaine that's helping with the detox, but there's something that these various medicines are doing to help people psychologically, to help them resolve issues that are related to their substance dependence. But you can see with iboga that these are themes that are kind of related to iboga in their ritual usage. I saw my family from young to older and how everything has been and how I affected them. Some people had interactions with deceased relatives. One individual who was ostensibly Muslim had more or less a conversion experience during his ibogaine experience, and actually had an experience of talking with Jesus. So he was talking with an ancestral spirit during his experience. This person saying he or she had eyes closed most of the time and visions from the past, a profound sense of love for my family. This came up repeatedly. People's regrets for what the kind of damage they'd caused to their family and their relationships, but also love for their family, a piercing, almost intense, almost piercing agony as I was overwhelmed with the remorse and the waste and loss, feeling empathy with my family over all their hopes for me, dashed by my relentless pursuit of drugs. So this is a recurring theme as well. And people had to come to terms with this during their ibogaine experiences. So that's a very powerful sort of thing. Next slide, please. So in summary, apart from drug use, the most improved areas were in the family and social area. And you can see how this relates to what kinds of experiences people are having with the ibogaine. And their relationships with their family members and other people important in their lives are improved throughout the follow-up period. So we're relating this to the Bwiti African sacramental context with iboga, binding of family and ancestors. And we also are seeing that delayed effects may have happened. That is, some people might not have gotten, immediately been clean from their problem substances, but then later on they were able to get clean. So I see this as being a process where people are still contending, they're still integrating these experiences, and they're still dealing with everything that they've got going on in their lives. And they might be able to stop for a while, and then they quote unquote relapse. So they start using again, and then they do better again in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, quick question. So if they're initially unavailable. So how is it that it became available after becoming unavailable?
Oh, in the study context?
I'm sorry, what was that?
That is in the course of the study. Oh, yeah, so these are people that I wasn't able to reach maybe at 1 month or 2 or 3 months. You know, I called them, they didn't respond. I called them 5 times. They might have told me, stop calling me. You know, but then there's people I couldn't reach in the early stages. And then later on, they said, I want to be part of the study. I'm doing great. And, you know, so.
Oh, they reached out to you after, like, initially?
Some people, or they started responding to my calls after some point. There was one person who actually yelled at me and said, stop calling me. But I really tried following up with them. So yes, there are some people who were I couldn't reach in the beginning, or who just didn't respond to my calls. Yes, so yeah, next slide, please. I think it's good. This is a good place to stop, actually. And in summary, I think my sense of, you know, what is the possibility for ibogaine treatment becoming accepted or legalized in the U.S.? I'm not optimistic. In New Zealand, they actually, you know, they started allowing and they legalized the prescription of treatment in 2010. And in part because, at least in part because of a death on the North Island in New Zealand, treatments were halted there. And they weren't doing many treatments to begin with. It's a low population, and not many people were seeking treatment. But you know, despite there being some gains there with New Zealand allowing treatment, and also the proliferation of ibogaine clinics around the world, the self-help, the activist-generated ibogaine treatment movement has really had a profound effect. And there are clinics in many different countries around the world. And people are learning more and more about safety. I've got the recently published clinical guidelines for ibogaine-assisted detoxification, which is put out by Gita. So people are getting better and better at providing safe treatment. People are getting better at knowing what kinds of screening to do. So the treatments are safer, which isn't to say they're entirely safe still, but I think there's a lot of resistance on the part of people in the medical and scientific communities. A lot of people are afraid of the psychoactive effects. They immediately think this is evil because it's got the psychoactive effects. They are resistant to even allowing research. So, you know, the possibility of going to a phase 3 clinical trial just isn't there right now, at least in this country. People tried in the 90s to get NIDA to allow studies, and it's just not going to happen right now. Hopefully, with the publication of my study and with Jeff Knoller's study in New Zealand, we'll have that. You know, that'll help convince some of the people in the scientific and medical communities, and that'll help, you know, change the situation there. But I think we also need to be changing public opinion. That is kind of gradually changing as well. But all in all, I think even, you know, in the face of all the legal challenges and all the challenges that the treatment providers have been facing over these decades, you know, we still have so many treatment providers, and we have the possibility of people finding treatment. I would like to see that legalized in the United States, of course. And I think it would make it safer too, to be able to, you know, because people are getting treatments underground in the U.S. still, and in other countries, and people are getting ibogaine and iboga root bark off the internet and self-administering, which I don't recommend for anybody to do that without getting medical tests. And so, but I'm not optimistic that it's going to be happening for ibogaine like it's happening for MDMA right now. That's a really big win that MDMA is I think they're heading towards phase 3 clinical trials, and I think that we're going to see the legalization of MDMA treatment, you know, within the next decade, probably much sooner than 10 years. But ibogaine treatment is going to continue to evolve, and it's going to continue to exist. So, and then there's the 18MC question: is that going to be developed as a treatment substance, and is it going to be effective, and is it going to be as effective as ibogaine? And are the pharmaceutical companies going to explore that? You know, there are all these questions, but I'm optimistic about ibogaine. I'm optimistic about iboga as a medicine. I'm not so optimistic about the legalization. But the state-by-state approach might work. In Vermont and New York, there has been legislation proposed to allow for ibogaine treatment or to advocate for ibogaine research. So they haven't passed that legislation, but at least there are starts there. And with the model of the cannabis here in the United States, I think state by state could potentially work. And with the opioid dependence crisis that we're experiencing in this country, especially the New England states seem to be moving towards some kind of measures to try to address that. So that's also helpful. Yeah.
We're a little bit over time, but I think we can do questions for 8 minutes or so. And
I apologize for going over time.
Oh, no,
Happy to do questions.
Started late.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of the fatality rates for people that are doing typical rehab? Because I know that, I know that that's something that is...
So conventional treatment, death rates. I don't have a good handle on that. Ken Alpa would be a really good person to ask. That information is available, and we're probably going to be including some of that data in our revisions. So definitely is. Yeah. There's another question. Yeah.
In terms of adverse effects, I wonder if, I know you talked about death, of course, but what about like psychological effects? Like I know a lot of the other psychedelics like ayahuasca and 5-MeO-DMT and stuff can have adverse effects psychologically, but what about with ibogaine?
That's a really good question, and and it's been described by, I think Sasha Shulgin described ibogaine as a rough trip, and and that's with people. That's for people who aren't dependent on some substance. It can be a rough trip.
But what about afterwards? Like does it leave people more messed up psychologically than?
I have not seen any. I have not even heard any anecdotal evidence that is happening. Which I can't say one way or the other for sure because I haven't heard any anecdotal evidence. But there hasn't been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any research done to look into that. That's an excellent question.
I share my experience with several hundred patients over a period of years. So that has a very stark, honest look at things that we avoid looking at. So it kind of breaks through that. That leaves people very raw, and then without really nurturing environment, not like therapy and counseling. That's the thing is putting them into a sober living or counseling could be worse, right? So they just need to really be nurtured, stress-free environments, not back to a place where they have to be accountable and try to fix things in the past. That's the most important thing. You put them right back where they got to start over. And that can be damaging. The use of 5-MeO-DMT as an entheogenic, where it really gives it very connected with source. Experience can really help with some of that being exposed to back to core traumas. So yeah, it's very traumatizing, but for people that need to detox with opiates, and that's why I'm a firm believer that it should really be primarily used right now for opiate dependency as a detox, and then with, again, follow-up protocols, it could be...
So would you say that the likelihood of psychological damage is as high as with the other psychedelics?
I think any psychedelic has the opposite impact because again, it shows you what you kind of because they all have this the common denominator permeating the blood-brain barrier. So there's things that we've been these rigid ways of seeing things. There's avoidance mechanisms built into our brain to avoid pain and trauma. And so when you break through that and you get exposed to that and you have no way to block off of it, well, how do you integrate? Well, who's helping you deal with that new way of seeing the world? And so it's really, anytime you're doing psychedelics, there needs to be some consideration for you to have no idea what's going to come out on the other end.
I'd like to add too, also you looking at like ayahuasca, we have a lot of shaman practitioners that there's stories of the black magic, and I mean there's a lot more going on there in the subcontext of not just giving the treatment, and it's like I don't know, I feel like the ibogaine seems to be a little bit more purified in the way that it's being done medically and for the detox and not for the spiritual solely, where you kind of cross that line with some of the other ones where people going in for spiritual and people playing spiritual doctor, and so you can fall into that trap a little bit more easily. I mean, I'm not ruling it out, but I'm just saying that element, it makes it a little bit more shady on some of the other substances.
I would actually go so far as to say that even using ibogaine as a detoxer from opiates is not addressing the core problem for most people by itself, and that really is a almost irresponsible application of medicine, because what you're doing is just uncovering what they've been using as a protective guard against the environment and culture that they're not able to adapt to. And then you send them right back to it without that shield, that armor.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah.
I might have missed it, but what were the 6-month and 12-month changes in the VDI scores?
Good question. So I have a slide, which is actually, it's going to, so just keep paging through. I'll tell you when you get there. It's probably going to be about, oh, actually, it's not that far. Oh, okay. So we're actually, this is not going to appear in the article, and that's disappointing to me, but we realized that because we had a small N, I was focused on the ASI and only had 9 people doing this at follow-up. So, so pre-treatment, you can see their scores, and this is pre-treatment versus 1 month. The mean back depression inventory score goes down, which is an improvement, 0.05, right on 0.05, even with just 9 people. And at 12 months, clearly the same 9 people. Actually, I think there's one person that's different. It just happened to be the same exact average score, which kind of looks funny. But at 12 months, we're seeing also 0.05 p-value for the reduction in the BDI score. So that's promising. Yeah.
What is BDI again?
Back depression inventory. Yeah. So it's also a self-rating scale. So for depression. Yeah.
You said the mechanism of action is unknown. Are there any theories or speculation?
Oh, there are many. Yeah. Yeah, there are many theories, and they've kind of evolved over the years. And I'm not that up on the pharmacological theories, though. One of the ones that's coming up is that ibogaine seems to increase the expression of GDNF, which is glial-derived neurotrophic factor, and thereby seems to be kind of creating an environment for the growth or regrowth of nerve cells, maybe damaged nerve cells, or so. It's interesting that you ask this question because this is in direct opposition to that Purkinje cell damage paper that came out. It reminds me of. You're probably familiar with the MDMA study that falsified data that showed holes in the brain from MDMA. Oprah Winfrey showed it on national television, right? So so what they're showing is that the studies are showing is that ibogaine actually increases the expression of GDNF in the brain. By the way, 18MC does not. So this could be helping to at least make new neuronal connections or regrow damaged nerve cells. So
that's something that could happen in the time span of a treatment session?
I can't say. I just don't know enough about it to say for sure. But this is also, and as an aside, ibogaine has been shown in a few cases to be able to help people with Parkinson's symptoms, and quite dramatically. And so, and I think there is some research now that's been underway, I think at Columbia University, where they're looking at ibogaine for treating Parkinson's. And this may be related to, who knows, but it could be related to the GDNF reduction as well. So that's interesting, yeah.
Neuroplasticity, is going to be a factor, I think, when you talk about the abation of withdrawal symptoms immediately afterwards. So it's like literally immediately afterwards. So returning to some neuroplasticity immediately. Whether or not it's regenerated, probably not within the time frame, but over time maybe.
Yeah.
And the noribogaine, which is a fat-soluble metabolite that's in there for 30, 60 days, depending on the biomass index and their metabolism, is really the period of time when people find that they have a lack of craving, a lack of emotional charge to things, which is I've experienced myself. Yeah. And that when it's gone and it leaves, all of a sudden you start to build a case again, so you ruminate more. And that really is, and from a direct experience, like my brain is holding on to things as opposed to being more lucid and more flexible. So again, I think that has to do with neuroplasticity.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, it'd be great to be able to do a sustained pharmacological and psychological study over those, especially those first couple of months. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. Oh yeah, brain imaging as well. Yeah. There's a question back here.
I had a question about multiple treatments.
Oh yeah.
Understanding is that they can be more effective, and for this you're just doing one treatment.
Yeah, for the most part, and as I was mentioning earlier, I think 3, maybe 4 people in the study went back for a second treatment, but it was uncommon. But yes, not in our study because our N is too small to be able to show that there's an effect with multiple treatments. But in the preclinical, the animal studies, it's been shown that that multiple treatments seem to work better than single treatment, and just also anecdotally. And I think there might be some evidence in some of the unpublished studies that with people, but I don't know. Do you have any? Does anyone here know?
So I mean, of the recidivism is relatively high. Only about 20% that just leave directly. Are going to stay, not ever use again. Now many will use, and then they don't find the need to keep using the way they did. So very rarely do they get back to the way it was. Maybe half that have to come back for a second treatment, but the rate of success on the second, even third treatment, unfortunately, sometimes is much greater, much greater. So second and third treatments can really help.
Yeah, again, something that there should be data that's generated about this, second and third treatments. Yeah, so they will say, and this is what they say about ibogaine as well, iboga. Oh, we can't make it legal because it's too dangerous. Oh, compared to what, right? Compared to what?
Because you only need to use it once or twice.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, it wasn't placed on Schedule 1 because it's dangerous. It was placed on Schedule 1 because it's psychoactive. So that's the scary thing.
Yeah, it was thrown in there, but I think if you really look back on it, they were all put in there because it was freeing people from like control, really.
Yes.
Flowers and guns, and they weren't going to fight, and so we said we can't have that.
Yeah.
Let's take these off the streets.
Fully with you on that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
One more question?
I have a quick one, very quick one. Is there any indication that microdosing ibogaine would have any effect or might lead to positive outcomes for opioid addicts?
Yes. Yes, and actually there are people who are working with microdosing with ibogaine as well. And there isn't anything published, but I've heard that people are having good results with that.
Yeah. Microdosing with ibogaine or iboga?
Either in both, yeah. So I've heard of people using total alkaloid extract or ibogaine HCl or root bark. Yeah.
It is also in sananga and some mixes of hape, so people are getting some microdosing doing those other substances as well.
There's iboga in those?
Yeah. The sananga has there's some derivative of it in sananga, and in some of the hape mixes it is in there, little tiny bits.
But it wouldn't be from the iboga plant because that's from a different continent.
I know, but I'm not sure.
The chemical,
but the chemical.
Yeah, I know that there are some providers who are working with microdosing as well. So, yeah.
One quick question: do you know if it's only effective if it grows in Gabon, or can you actually plant over here and grow?
That's a good question. There are people who are trying to grow it elsewhere. I mentioned Chris Jenks earlier, a chemist. He's working with some people in South Africa to grow it there. I don't know how well that's working, but I've heard of people growing it in their yards in Mexico, and so I don't know is the answer.
The answer is, generally speaking, you may be able to keep it alive, but it's probably not going to produce very high levels of ibogaine, and it really only grows in that one region naturally. Greenhouses, and then like the hairy root method, which is just a lot of biomass, and then you can break it down so you can still get the ibogaine extract.
Oh yeah. So there are
the plant itself and taking it to maturity 6 to 8 years, not likely in anywhere else other than that very specific region.
So you think it's because of the weather or the soil?
All the above: barometric pressure, soil content, everything. You can't. Soil is really the primary thing. Soil.
Yeah. I mentioned
many years of all the different subsystems that are involved in the ecology of dirt.
Yeah. So and I mentioned that the scarcity problem, but Voacangine is much more abundant, and it grows in a much wider area. And so the semi-synthesis from Voacangine is a good route right now for producing more ibogaine.
And I've done ibogaine from both. I've done ibogaine from iboga and ibogaine from Voacangine. And to me, the experience wasn't a whole lot different. But I wasn't trying to come off substances when I did it, and they were both very profound, but I couldn't tell. So I haven't been able to measure it against patients because patients have varying degrees, but they haven't done but one or the other. They haven't done both. You know what I'm saying? They've done just one.
I know that since we're over time, but I would love to be able to sit with a bunch of people who, I'd love to be able to sit with everybody in this room actually, and continue talking, because I have some questions too, like, is ibogaine more effective, or has it been shown to be more effective than using a total alkaloid extract, or do you like to use them in combination? What are people using, and is there any evidence that one's better than the other, or that you can, that you're getting some effects with the TA that you're not getting with ibogaine, things like that. I would love to be able to find out more about that. But
Good info on that?
Any thoughts?
Ibogaine shell is used specifically for the ability to accurately dose a flood dose to hit all the receptor sites when you're dealing with somebody who has already gotten a weakened immune system and other issues. You got to be really careful not to overdose. And you don't know how much is in any regular raw iboga, and even TA. You've got to measure every single batch of it. And then you have the other alkaloids which are affecting the receptor sites as well. So the reason that we use the HCl in any of the major clinics is because you can really get down right to the the exact 13 to 18 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and so it's really important for safety and for also stable moving around and making sure it stays.
Okay.
Thank you. Those are the primary factors included. Total alkaloid, people believe because of the other 11 alkaloids that are involved, it could have some additional effects maybe on a more spiritual level, but we know it's the ibogaine that really addresses and can deal with the withdrawals. I don't know that the others have much of an effect on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.